So in the studios, we have Melissa D'Ellena with D'Ellena Law. Thanks for being here today, Melissa.
Thank you for having me. Good morning.
You're very welcome. Good morning. And Mike, I know last week actually, and this kind of prompted, kind of inspired us to do this show. We got a question from one of our listeners.
Yes, we did.
Yeah. So do you want to read off that question from Doris from Davisville? Thank you, by the way, Doris, for tuning in.
Well, Doris was wondering, what are some of the risks involved with a for sale by owner?
Nice.
It's a great topic and one that I think a lot of our listeners are probably interested in, because I hear often from clients, well, I'm paying so much money to these realtors. What really are they doing? Can I just do it myself and save all of that money?
Yep.
I'm sure you get a lot of feedback at listing appointments.
All the time. Yeah.
And I can certainly appreciate that, 6%, which tends to be the market rate for a good listing agent to take your real estate and sell it, is a big premium. But first of all, and I'm sure, Emilio, you can talk further about this, oftentimes you are going to get more money for the property with the marketing efforts that are undertaken by a realtor. So right out of the gate, although, yes, you are going to spend more, it ends up yielding bigger returns in the end.
You're right, though, with that. 85% of for sale by owner, and that's 85%
Wow.
of what they would have if they had a real estate agent. So
it just goes to show that while there may be some cost savings, you're really leaving money on the table. But that seems to be the biggest obstacle to overcome, is just to make sure clients understand there is a shortfall with the amount they're going to net as a function of not having the agent. Then comes the real fun, is the paperwork.
Oh, yeah.
This is really just a paper shuffle. That's what real estate is. That's what real estate law is just we're really fancy paper pushers. And my experience is most people don't like paperwork.
Yeah.
So I think another major advantage of having a real estate agent who is seasoned in your area and who is well-versed in real estate is to identify all of the necessary legal disclosures and proper state disclosures that have to be completed when you're advertising your house for sale, like the sales disclosures.
Yeah.
It's required, and that's not something that sellers are privy to.
No. Where do they get it?
They can get it, I don't know.
Where do they get it? They have to get it from, I believe, a real estate agent.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
right?
I have access to them, but generally speaking,
course.
I don't know that they have access to it. I don't think it's a document within the public domain that clients would have access to retrieve it.
I don't think so. So and also,
it is required by the state. I mean, I suppose there are other ways that you could go about disclosing things of your home. Most people know a realtor or a real estate attorney, so they would have access to getting it. But generally speaking, it's something the realtor gives you, and the realtor explains to you what some of these disclosures are. And most important is that you have to appreciate that disclosures will survive the transaction. So it's really important to be very honest and forthcoming with what you're putting on there, because it could give rise to litigation later if you ever misrepresented yourself. So knowing what the disclosures are, and then being able to recite a sales agreement. Of course, if a for sale by owner, or FSBO as they're called in the industry, is successful in marketing their property, or there's a neighbor driving by that says, hey, my friend wants to buy your house, here they are. Now we need to identify the paperwork that's involved, which would be including the sales agreement. Again, it's not something that a seller or buyer, for that matter, will have access to preparing. So at that point, you do have to hire an attorney to draft those documents for you at your expense. And while we don't usually collect 6%, unfortunately. Again, if you've left money on the table and you're paying a lot of money for an attorney to draft these documents, it ends up still costing you in the long run.
Yeah, it does. And again, 183 steps in the process. Said that earlier on in the show. 183 steps. What do you do? I mean, do you know all the 183 steps?
I do think that it's a good idea to have an agent. And as a seller, you have to think, well, what happens if a buyer comes in with an agent and you're for sale by owner? Are you going to be paying the buyer's agent's commission? And now understand that that buyer is represented. So the buyer has an agent who's making sure their best interests are represented. But again, you as a seller don't have that same counsel and guidance. So again, a lawyer is only going to do so much. Having the boots on the ground, being able to identify the benefits and things that you need to overcome relative to the property is really what the agent's role is.
Yeah, totally. So, here's another thing too, is when I said that for sale by owners net 85% of what they would have if they had an agent, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're always listing their property at the wrong price, even though that does happen most of the time. Okay. But what that means is when you go down to negotiations, and folks, it's not just negotiating price. It is negotiating the inspections, okay?
Terms, yep.
The terms, so, man. So with inspections, a buyer can come in and ask for a credit and this and that. And if the buyer has representation and if you don't, especially if it's a good buyer's agent, you're dead in the water.
Absolutely.
That 85 is average, keep in mind. You might be at 80% of what you should have got.
Right. And not to mention, if you're paying a buyer's agent commission, that's 2.5% to 3% is industry standard. So you're paying approximately half as a seller for your buyer to have representation, yet you are going it alone, which is really not a lot of financial savings, but what you're risking is quite substantial.
So you got the risk of loss,
Market value.
Market value loss. You've got the risk of taking on all of the legalities of it, right?
Absolutely.
And like you said, the sales disclosures survive the transaction. You got to be very careful. Disclose everything.
Absolutely. Over disclosure is definitely the way to go.
It is.
You can't get hurt with the truth. So you put it out there and see what happens.
Pre-list home inspections as well.
And actually, I see a lot of clients starting to trend where they're attaching those pre-listing home inspections to the sales disclosures, or in lieu of a sales disclosure. They'll say, see attached inspection report. So that way you are adequately disclosing all of the information that you're not guessing on the age of the heating system. You've got somebody who's come in and actually assessed it.
That's a great point. So that was a really good example of why, somebody... the risks of not having an agent and why they should have an agent. But what about for legal? What about the legal end?
So legal representation is equally important to having an agent, although if you're only going to do one, I think probably agent representation, frankly, would be more important as a seller, because you really need, for all the reasons we've identified, that person in your transaction. But legally speaking, the transactions are becoming more and more complex.
Yes.
Sellers are required to have deeds prepared. They are required to establish residency affidavits. And if they're not residents, we've talked previously that then there's a non-resident withholding tax that could be imposed on them. So it is of critical importance that clients are reaching out to counsel so that they are adequately protected, not only on the sale, but also on the purchase. We work with lots of different lenders where we serve as closing and title attorney. So generally, we are acting as representation on behalf of the lender. But we also work very closely with the agent and with the buyers because, again, with the amount of transactions and how complex they are and the different types of inventory out there, buyers have questions. I had one this morning where the buyer's purchasing a property, it's a bank-owned, and the other agent was giving them a hard time about dewinterizing the property. So the buyer's agent asked me to get involved, contact the seller's attorney, so that way, while I'm not usually involved as a closing attorney this early, they had the relationship. They had the door open and the line of communication open to talk to us about getting some help and some guidance at an early point in the transaction, and we will see them through to the end with doing the title work and the closing and all of that.
Yeah, that's huge. It takes on a different dynamic, though, too, when you bring an attorney in, especially when it comes to some issues,
And that's the problem is right now there's lots of transactions that have issues.
A ton of them.
And I would tell any listener that any good real estate attorney is going to get the job done. At the end of the day, they're searching the title, you're buying a house. But it's when there's problems in the middle of the transaction and you need access to your real estate attorney, you need to make sure that you've got someone that you have an open relationship with and you have the opportunity to call on to say, okay, I've got a question. So now what do we do?
And every single transaction, I don't care what the transaction is or how simple and cookie cutter you may think it is. It never is. There's always, always, always something that comes up. Recently we've had, and it's actually some of our listeners, thank you so much for listening and using us. they had an oil tank in the ground.
Yes.
And I've ran into it before, but not to this extent. It was before a house was listed. We ran into it and we took it out and whatever, and and it was taken care of. But now we're in a transaction and it happened. So we had to figure out. We had to work with different agencies, different companies, and these our poor sellers. They went through a lot getting this done, and it's expensive.
Yes.
And so these things happen all the time. What if you have a cesspool on the property? But that's a whole different subject for a whole nother day. But Melissa, that was a great segment, very informative. Thank you so much. And again, Doris, thank you so much for the question.